Good morning and welcome. Right off the bat, I wanted to say how much we very much appreciate you having chosen to listen to our webinar this morning, as I know there is another TV event taking place in Washington, D.C. However, as with our webinar, I'm sure the hearing in D.C. is going to be recorded and probably analyzed to death by the TV pundits for future observation. So we can start with our webinar. After having looked at lots of functionality in QAD like MRP, CRP, advanced forecasting, sim loading, and then these last 2 months, we spent some time talking about accounting and variance subjects. This month and next, let's discuss some aspects of security in QAD. The issues of phishing, SOX, virus, ransomware, and all of the other security issues around the internet, including the event in Washington today, bring to mind how much we need to protect what is probably the most important data in our company, that which is in QAD. So today we'd like to talk about and explore SOX. What is it? How did it come to be? We'll cover security in depth, talk about lots of aspects of security in QAD. Talk about users, employees, engineers. We'll talk a little bit about menus and restrictions, roles, permissions, and memberships. And then next month, we'll cover some additional security issues that we'll cover at the end of the session. So, as I always say, every time we have a webinar, there's lots of new terms that you need to become familiar with when dealing with security functionality in QAD. We'll cover such concepts as roles, permissions, passwords, restrictions. So if you do not know the meaning of a term or a phrase, please use Google to look it up, or go to the knowledge base on the QAD website, or send Denise or I an email, and we'll try and be glad to try and assist you. Remember that in order to do a good job of any subject that we cover in our webinars, you should have some good, solid work instructions, and you should have a company dictionary or wiki. And I think I mentioned last month that I ran across this great little article in the Midwest user group from spring of 2018 by Bill. I love my wiki. That tells you basically how to set one up. So let's talk about SOX. This is the thing that everyone in corporate America knows as SOX. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 was enacted on July 30th. It was known as the Public Company Accounting Reform and Investor Protection Act. There's a name in the Senate. And in the House, it was the Corporate and Auditing Accountability, Responsibility, and Transparency Act. So it got shortened most commonly to SOX. It was enacted as a reaction to a number of major corporate accounting scandals, including both ENRON and WorldCom. SOX is a federal law that sets forth all the requirements for public companies, boards, managements, public accounting firms, and a number of the provisions of the Act also apply to privately held companies, such as the willful destruction of evidence to impede federal investigations. Hark again to our Washington, D.C. event today. The sections of the bill for the apply to public directors and their officers of the company. If you get a chance, there is a great movie called The Smartest Guys in the Room, or ENRON, The Smartest Guys in the Room. It's available on YouTube, and it talks about ENRON and the fact that it led to the dissolution of Enron, and any of us remember Arthur Andersen, which was one of the largest 5 largest audit and accounting partnerships in the world. And so the Enron caused those problems. Kenneth Lay, the second guy from the left, was the founder. He was the guy that was found guilty on 10 counts of fraud, but regrettably he died in 2006 while he was vacationing in Colorado 3 months before his scheduling sentences. So he got out of the issue. There is also WorldCom, and WorldCom was MCI. They got caught for booking line costs. If we hark back to last or May's accounting webinar, they got costs for booking line costs as capital expenditures, and they also inflated revenues with bogus entries into some kind of corporate unallocated revenue accounts. So they got caught, and the Enron caused this Sarbanes-Oxley to be enacted. So what did Sarbanes-Oxley do? Well, it closed loopholes in the accounting practices, strengthened corporate governance, increased accountability, increased corporate transparency for the shareholders and financial transactions, strengthened whistleblower protections, and actually made it so executives of the organizations could go to jail for any malfeasance. It also created what's called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which is run by the FDA, or the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations for Accounting. The 3 main areas of SOX include certification, disclosure, and internal evaluation. The Section 404 is what relates to ERP systems. It requires annual filing of control evaluation reports. You have to document existing controls, test them for effectiveness, and report any gaps or deficiencies. The controls and procedures should conform to this COSO, and the key point is that they need to have a reasonable assurance of control, not absolute assurance. There is in QAD 2 primary areas that support the Section 404 of SOX. The first is role-based security. This involves permissions and resource users and application venues, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the session. And then next month, we'll talk about segregation of duties and how that provides another enforcement layer within the application for SOX compliance. The requirements for SOX are, first of all, you have to provision the process. In other words, identify which areas are pertinent to control. Then you have to have procedures for setting up users, roles, permissions, etc., SOD. Then you also, when people leave the organization, you have to be able to offboard those individuals. In other words, eliminate the users from the corporate databases upon their departures. Then every month, year, period, whatever your audit team says you should do, you need to provide evidence that your controls exist within the business and that there's approval for access, and we'll go through that a little bit later. Since we all use QAD, the question becomes, is QAD environment SOX compliant? And there's basically 6 areas that QAD has for SOX compliant. There's the role-based security access, which we'll talk about. There's password management, which is part of the security control and the user definitions. There's logon security. There's operating and progress security. There's workstation level security, and there's .NET security. Now, these last 3 we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on because those are pretty significant in terms of their technical nature, and it would take probably a couple hours to go through those anyway. So we'll concentrate on the top three. Much of QAD's attention to security is directed at what's called 21 CFR Part 11. And this is part of the federal regulations that has to do with the Food and Drug and has to do with the electronic signatures and how those electronic signatures are as trustworthy and reliable as paper records. So basically, QAD security is designed to prevent users from denying responsibility for their online activities. So in order to do that, SOX has three basic, or QAD has three basic areas of functionality. First of all, advanced passwords, the enhanced user account administration we'll go over, and then some areas of intrusion detection, which allows a system to know exactly who is doing what to whom. So how do you set up the enhanced security within QAD? There's a couple of steps. First of all, you need to identify your security plan. So this is that provisioning process. You have to actually set down what your plan is and how you're going to go about it. And we'll give you just a quick view at a checklist that you can use for that security plan. Then you have to identify security administrator or administrators. Depends, normally an accounting person, finance, IT. I've even seen security administrators in operations. Then you need to define the email system. We'll talk a little bit about that. Then you update your security control parameters in 36.3.24, which we'll cover. Then you update your user accounts with 36.3.1, and then you'd run your force password change utility to make sure that everybody's got their most current passwords. The checklist for implementing or defining a security plan is, first of all, you have to have a high-level overview of your business environment. Do you have multiple facilities? Do you have multiple sites? Do you have multiple domains? Where are your users? Where are the licenses, etc.? You really need to understand exactly how your business is organized. Then you need to review all of the security documentation, and that includes anything on the net, anything having to do with emails, any of your board of directors requirements as far as security is concerned. Then you need to look at all application-related files and determine the appropriate permissions and ownership settings for those. Optionally, and we'll talk about this next week, you need to define your segregation of duty requirements. Then you need to look at your domains and what users are going to access those. You need to define your roles. There's some specific types of security that affect field sites, inventory movement codes, etc. Then you need to define how you're going to get rid of users, deactivate old user accounts. You need to define how you're going to keep your security up to date. How are you going to create new users and passwords? Are you going to have a single sign-on? Your password policies, which we'll cover, and then how often you need to have users change their passwords, and define your failed attempts. So what do you do to implement the security plan? Well, first of all, like I say, we need to go through the 36.3.24, then set up your user permissions and role membership, and then alternate the internal controls regarding segregation of duty. So in 36.3.24, security control parameters, there are basically three categories: control parameters, password complexity parameters, and password creation and aging parameters. So if we look at the security control in 36.3.24, you can see here that you have to define your timeout. How long are you going to allow users to be in the system before you time them out. There's an in-force license user count toggle that we'll talk about a little bit later in relationship to license registration. There is an in-force OS user ID option. That basically means that you could use the Active Directory logon to actually log into QAD if you wanted to. There is header display mode for non.NET processes. There's a maximum number of failures, which the default is 6. You need to define your administrative roles. We'll talk about that when we get to roles and permissions. Then you need to define your email system. This allows you to communicate within the system via email. There's a logon history level, which you can set to either keep track of all failed logons or all logons or none. I don't think I'd recommend none, but failed, all is probably a viable. Then there's enabled reason type. So in .NET, we've got the difference between active and enabled. And when you enable a customer, you need, or a user, you have to have a definition of a reason code defined in 36.217. Then you've got the auto disenablement reason, which is defined again in your reason code. And then you've got single sign-on enabled. At the lower section of 3.24, you've got the minimum length of your password. You've got the minimum number of numeric characters you need to have, the minimum number of non-numeric characters. You need to have the minimum reuse days. Then you need to define your minimum reuse changes. How often can you reuse changes? Then you've got a password creation method. The default is no, but this basically tells how the system's going to do the force password control. Then you've got the password expiration dates, which I just had mine changed to one of my clients, and warning days. So how many days in the future of the expiration date do you have it? So you set up your security, and the security uses these 6 parameters to govern these account lockout policies. Like as I said, the minimum password length set to a default of 6, maximum of 16. The password complexity and all the other ones that we looked at, it keeps 5 password histories. It has a minimum password change of 90 days. There's a password change on the enable logon and the account lockout after 6 failures for a duration of 30 minutes. There are also some specialty security areas that we need to be concerned with. Database security, domain security, entity security, site, account, and field security. In database, you're basically talking about, are you allowed to view or update tables? Are you allowed to update fields? There's some issues for OBDC connection, and then there's actual database security in progress, and basically these are a little bit beyond our scope of the presentation, so we'll leave those for another date. As far as the domain is concerned, first subset of the database is domain, and a domain represents a business operation with a single security and chart of accounts. Each database has to have at least one domain, and each domain has to have at least one entity and a primary entity set. In terms of the SE versus EE, you can see here that in the domain create in .NET, you've also got general, shared sets, operation, company, cross-company, and invoice numbering tabs that you need to be concerned with when you create your domains. In terms of entity security, there's the old SE and EE versions, and entity security applies to transactions that are created in the general ledger module. So such things as standard transactions, transaction post, year-end closing, etc. Those are controlled by the entity security, and you're going to define users and roles that have access to that. Site security maintenance is to specify users or roles that can update sites. Sites basically affect inventory data. Or if a site field is on a selection criteria of a menu, then the site security is in force. In multiple database environments, you got to remember that site security must be defined separately for each database. There are some special situations for security. I hope everybody knows who Scott Galecki is. If you don't, you should become familiar with Scott. He's kind of a legend in the world of QAD. He currently works for Sungate Solutions. Got his MBA from University of Michigan. He's worked for Braveport, Pridge and Clay. He's a past president of Midwest User Group, and he's an author. His book, Back to Basics, Dump and Load, is quite a good read. And his law basically says you can have access to it if you can fix it, should you happen to break it. But if you can't, then you don't get access to it. There are also some other infrequent processes that require access security. Physical inventories, that's usually a once-a-year process. Unused modules, you can set some security settings to that. Control files, archive routines, etc. So those are some special circumstances. Onboarding is basically where you begin with your user setup. Onboarding involves such things as general orientation, reviewing key general administrative procedures, tour of facility, job assignments, introductions, schedules, payroll, etc. And the last is hardware and software issues, where QAD comes into play when you have to onboard individuals. That involves desktop support, computers, displays, mouses, that kind of thing. And then how do you set up QAD online or QAD security? You may also have other enterprise applications, shop floor, or excuse me, Salesforce.com, any others, CERM, HR, ADP, Time, Concur, document applications such as Master Control, Agile, Irena, Pilgrim, any other applications such as manufacturing execution systems, labeling requirements, warehouse management, email. So these are all the things that you need to concern yourself when you onboard a individual into your organization. So as far as QAD is concerned, every user must be identified in the system, given access to the domain, at least one entity, and associated with at least one role in order for that user to gain access to the system. So here's the 36.3.1. This is user management. You first of all have to define for the user ID the language that they're going to use. The variant is an optional field that you can use to define where a person is located. There's a country code that is available. Restricted is just a reference-only field. There's a user type, and if we look at user types, you need to identify a group or a trusted group of individuals within your organization to administer these assignments and setups. There's basically 4 different default user types: employee, customer, QAD, and API. Employee is probably the most common, and you can set up other user kinds of security with roles: super users, admin, report design, etc., etc. So you also have access location, which could be used. There's a time zone field, initials, which is kind of a free-form field. Email definition, this is where we define what our email system is, what is, if the record is active or inactive, there's the email address, there's a menu substitution field. If you're going to use 36.4.7, there's also a remarks field, which is just a brief text field, and then you come down to the system access, which tells you are you enabled or unenabled. This is different than the active. This was affected in EE, so you can now enable or unenable a user. There is the enablement reason, so every time you change the enablement flag, you have to put in an enablement reason, which is defined in 36.2.17. There's a forced password flag, which can be used. There's an update field, and if you choose the update field, you're asked to put in a new password and confirm that password. 36.3.4, user domain entity access maintained. This is where you define which domain and entity a particular user has, and for every combination of domain and entity, you have basically a new workspace on the .NET environment. There's also a couple of other areas that we need to be concerned when creating users. The employee create. This is for people who are going to add labor to the system. And in a lot of cases with these, you need to have business relationships for employees, engineers, sites, entities, salesperson. All of these additional user identifications require a business relationship defined in EE. There's the engineer maintenance. You use engineer maintenance for anything to do with service and support. And in order for an engineer to be an engineer, he has to first be an employee. There is salesperson. You use salesperson maintenance to set up codes you associate with a business relationship to keep track of taxes, quotas, territories, etc. The territory here is updated in generalized code, and just a word of caution, changing that territory code in generalized code can do all sorts of issues to your quota reporting and emissions taxes, so just be careful about updating that. Printer default maintenance. Okay, this is to assign default to various users or menus. This is not exactly a security issue, but defining where users are able to print can have a significant impact on printing hard copy. And hard copy paper is, again, a security issue and needs to be addressed in your security plan and execution. Email definition. You define email definition in 36.4.20. This puts a builds a command line that allows you to communicate within QAD for various aspects. I'm not going to talk about much of it because it's basically beyond the scope of this presentation. It has to do with MIME attachments, UTF codes, etc., etc. So if you need any additional information, send Denise and I a quick email. User password maintenance 36.3.3 allows a user to update their own user ID and see various information about their particular user ID. If you check that, you're going to get the same option to update your password, new and confirmed. And then the 36.3.23.12 force password change utility. You run this if the security officer has determined that there's been some possible breach of your system or some attempt to subvert your security access, and that's usually an IT or a security officer when you're within your organization. The 36.3.23.1 logon attempt report is kind of handy. This shows you all of the attempts of logons. This has to do with that history level that we had, so you can keep track of who's doing what to whom. And in SE, you've got the same option to do that. There are a number of other security functions that can be and probably should be included in your security plan, such things as the 36.3.13.1 GL account security. This determines who is going to have access to update GL account information. There's the inventory movement code security update, 36.3.13.13. This has to do with shippers and ship to and who has access to change that. There are also a whole series of what are called general restrictions. And restriction maintenance, you can restrain access to inventory transfers, PO receipts, distribution orders, service and support. This is another level of restriction that is available to you. You can set these up, and this affects the programs that are covered in these restrictions. The values have to match perfectly. If there's one match that doesn't, it's not accepted, and typically these rules apply for all transactions within a particular set of functionality. For example, this 36.3.7.1 inventory transfer restriction, if you set this up for a particular set of roles, this will restrict 3.4.1, 3.4.2, 3.4.3, and 3.4.4. If you use the inventory detail, you can do restrictions on 3.1.1 and 3.1.2. We use this to restrict some of the people in quality, and only they can get in and change those particular values. And then you can do the same with unplanned issues and unplanned receipts. If you want to and you use this update restriction report is very handy. You can see here's the restriction menus available, and these are set by these categories that we saw, and this gives you a nice little report that tells you exactly who has restricted access and what their parameters are. Field security is also available. Field security restricts access to fields defined in QAD, maybe account currency exchange rates. For example, not all fields are available, but you can define certain fields on a screen that are available to update. You can define if it's available for design mode features or UI customization, and you can define the specific user fields. These are based on what are called business components, which is a combination of activity, role, and field. So in order to do this, the system administrator needs to enable the field security system-wide by checkboxing in the 36.2.5.1, and then you could go in for a specific field, a user ID, and define what fields they have access to. Word of caution, I've seen organizations who have relatively high turnover that field security can become almost a full-time job to keep track of who's coming and who's going and updating it. So field security is pretty powerful. It is complex and needs a lot of attention if you're going to try and implement field security. The menu system, I checked with QAD, and the menu system has been around for over 30 years now. And in .NET, the menu system itself has kind of disappeared, but for those of us who have used QAD for many, many years, we probably still use the menu and the selection, 7.1.1, 3.4.1. Those kinds of entries into the application will take you directly to a particular menu. And the menu system still has a lot of functionality. When we talk about configured screens next week, when we talk about segregation of duty, those are all going to be based upon the menu system. The A-level menus are basically how the system is coordinated. I ask the QAD help what this means in the future of Channel Islands. Nobody can tell me, so I'm assuming that the menu structure is still going to remain the same. If you want to modify the menu system, 36.4.4.1, I remember when we implemented the 32-soft PO rec system, we created our own menus out on the 99 menus. So we used the menu system maintenance to define that. If you put a name in the name value field, it actually acts as a shortcut. We've done that with a couple of menus, which is pretty helpful. Then there is the program information maintenance screen. This has to do with primarily with .NET setup, but you use that to help define whether it's a multi-domain, what image you want, etc. Then 36.4.14, user option telnet maintenance. This is an option for .NET and how it displays the HTML fields. You can set, and this is a common problem, the basic default for tabs in .NET is 5. And if anybody's used .NET on QAD, it's kind of nice to have maybe a dozen or 20 options for tabs across, and you'd use this maintenance screen to go in and change those. The navigation is a little wonky, but you can do that, and the users are very appreciative. The 36.16.12, I use this all the time. This allows me to keep track of users and what they're doing and where they are. It also can be used in conjunction with the connection manager. There's, at least in one organization, I've got some people in purchasing that tend to not know where they're doing, and I need to go in and make changes to their connection managers, and I usually use that 36.16.12 to keep track of what they're doing. There's lots of reports in QAD that help with security, log-on attempts, action reports, etc. I went through and looked at all the menus for security, for user activity, for employees, salespeople, security engineers, roles. So there's lots of information on QAD that helps you with the setting up of your security plans and the execution of those plans. The 36.3.23.2 user account status reports, kind of handy. Shows you what the user account is set at. There's both one for EE, same for SE. 36.3.24.4 is user access by application. So if you want to see what users have access to a particular application that you've got defined in your license registration, you can get that nice little report, tells you who's doing what to whom. Then role-based security. Now this is one of the primary tools that the system uses to control security within QAD. And all QAD EEs, I believe EE started with 2009, so it's all role-based. Roles are defined for each discrete area of the business: shipping, receiving, accounts payable, etc. Roles are then linked to menus. Here we are, menu function again, using role permission. And then users are assigned domains, as we saw in the domain and entity user screen we looked at. And then roles are assigned for entities and domains within the roles. And there's lots of tools provided to help with the process of that. So you use 36.3.6.1 role create. This defines what roles are there. Super user, there are a couple of names or roles that are reserved for the system. So super user is an existing name, can't be used as a role name. There's a number of roles that are supplied with the system where you can use the email system to notify a group of users if there's a new customer, supplier, employee, or end user created. And then you can use the 36.3.6.2 and 3 to look and review those roles that you create. The 36.3.6.5 role permission maintain. This is where you're going to associate a particular role with the menus. This is, luckily, this is a one-time deal, normally where you've set it up, but it is a fairly intensive process to go through. And then role membership defines what roles a particular user is assigned and what and how they're assigned to those roles. There's also an import and export, or an export and import functionality for roles. If you've got a whole bunch of changes that you've got to do, it's sometimes easier to use Excel or XML to do that. When you define your export, make sure you use XML as the extension, and then it puts it into Excel. You can make your changes in that and then re-import that into QAD. There's the 36.16.10.1 license registration. So this used to update user license values that you get from QAD. If we looked at those applications, you have to have a user license from QAD to use those. So you update that, and then this will give you a report of all of those users. There are concurrent session licenses and named user license. I also believe there's an infrequent user license, but this kind of explains how QAD counts any violations of the user logging process. And if you have a QAD audit, you're probably going to need to address this in your security plan. Offboarding is basically the reverse of onboarding. It's when somebody leaves the organization, if they're fired or quit or terminated, you need to communicate the departure to the rest of the organization. This number 2 is never done very well. Transfer employee knowledge to their successor. Recover their assets, PCs, cell phones, etc. Update org charts, and then 5, revoke the system asset access, either in ERP or other IT assets such as Salesforce.com or Agile or whatever. Then complete the pay process, perform the exit interview, do a letter of reference if that's part of your process, and then thank the exiting employee and engage former employees in employing it. This all needs to be part of SOX, so you need to have a procedure defined for that. You need to have discipline of people who are going to administrate this process. It needs to be tested, validated, and then you need to write a report on how that works and have approvals on the signature. So today we've talked about SOX, so we've got a little bit of idea of how it is or what it is and how it was put together. We've talked about securities, passwords, users, roles, permissions, memberships, restrictions, etc. And next week we'll cover a little bit more about security and discuss configured screens, audit trails, electronic signatures, and the segregation of duty functionality. And there are some additional issues we'll talk about also. So, Denise? there you go. That's QAD concerns and considerations. You want to take it back?
Got it. Thanks, Don.
There you go.
Fantastic as always. Okay, we will move right into the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them into your control panel. I'm going to take a quick look. I don't believe we have any questions as yet.
We've got Christian on the phone in case we have any technical questions, and Alex is available also. So
Yes, yes. We don't have any questions, but
okay.
What we'll do is we can go ahead and move along since we're coming up pretty quick on the hour anyway. So we'll go ahead and move along, and before I close out, I will take another look to see if we've received any questions. If anyone thinks of anything after the session has ended, certainly shoot us an email, pick up the phone, and just let us know what your questions are. We will include any questions and their answers if received before we publish. So please keep that in mind. Meanwhile, we'll go ahead and take a look at upcoming webinars. As Don mentioned, we have implications of QAD roles and responsibilities coming up next month, and that is followed by how to automate QAD data uploads in September. Registration for both of these is open, and as always, links are available at the bottom of all of our communications, as well as on our website too.
Thank you for your attendance, and good luck with your security processes.
Yes, yeah, and as Don mentioned a few times, anything else related or whatever you come up with, shoot us an email. We're happy to work with you to get things figured out. I'll go ahead and bring up the closing thought. Is the goal always is to resolve data issues swiftly, and well-designed data governance provides the right ownership and accountability model to get to the root cause and resolution of data issues. So as Don said also, thanks very much for your time today, everybody. We sure hope to see you again next month. Meanwhile, keep cool and have a great day.